speaker will be Achille Varzi from the Columbia University of New York, talking about the boundaries of things, where topology meets metaphysics.
Thank you. So I will try to stay within the time. It's going to be difficult. My talk is basically, thank you, of course, again for the opportunity to be here. I said that the other day, but it's a pleasure to repeat it. My talk will, in fact, be, in a way, a self-contained continuation of what I did on Saturday at the school in topological philosophy, even though it will differ significantly in one respect. There will be no formulas, not a single formula in my slides. I hope you don't mind that. I thought I would focus on one of the notions that we have been using virtually in every talk, which is certainly a central notion in topology, which is the notion of a boundary. And in particular, I would like to highlight what I take to be some important philosophical aspects of that notion, or some important philosophical issues that lie behind that notion. Since we've been using this notion so frequently, let me go back to the very beginning and give you a couple of quotes. The first one comes from Aristotle, who defined, he used the word limit, but it's pretty clear from this and other contexts that it can be replaced by boundary. He defined it as the last point of each thing, i.e., the first point beyond which it is not possible to find any part of the thing, and the first point within which every part of the thing is. That's, to my knowledge, the very first clear definition that we find. Of course, it was eventually systematized by Euclid, so this is how it goes in Euclid's Elements. A point is that which has no part. A line is breadthless length. The extremities of a line are points. A surface is that which has length and breadth only. The extremities of a surface are lines. A boundary is that which is an extremity of anything. So boundary is sort of the general concept. And I'm interested in, as I said, some philosophical issues, but specifically some metaphysical issues. And I want to start with one basic question that some of us have already raised. The first question is, are there any such things as boundaries over and above the bounded entities? Obviously, yesterday we heard several presentations doing away with boundaries and reconstructing such entities differently. So let me go a little bit through the issue in greater detail, even though I'm going to focus mainly on the next ontological question, but still. So you can say yes, or you can say no. I don't take any intermediate answer. If you say yes, boundary really exists, you may want to add, as most people do, that however they are lower dimensional entities and in fact depend ontologically, they're parasitic upon their, the things they bound. That's a very familiar position. It's the traditional position. It is in fact the view that goes back to Aristotle himself. Aristotle thought that boundaries are dependent particulars in this sense. The best version of this theory that I know of actually can be found in Boethius. He says there are several kinds of things that have their being in others. To make this clear by a widely known example, and this is to be underlined, showing that this is by no means his own original view, and in fact goes back to Aristotle, a line is something in a body, and what it is, it owes to the body. That is, it keeps its being through the body. If it is separated from the body, it does not subsist. Who by any sense faculty ever grasped a line separated from a body? Well, that's the what I call the classical view. Of course, it came to us not via Boethius. I don't know how many people are familiar with his way of putting things, but rather via Brentano. For example, in his writings on the continuum, but also in the theory of categories, he insists on this point. He says a boundary, even when itself continuous, can never exist except as belonging to something continuous of more or higher dimensions. Indeed, receives its fully determinate and exactly specific character only through the manner of this belongingness. Now, there will be, of course, a lot to be said about this, but I just want to put this view on the table as the classical view corresponding to the answer yes, although, of course, there are several variants. Most people today tend to answer no, however. Boundaries do not exist, although they can be retrieved as higher order as opposed to lower dimensional, and not entities but abstractions, higher order abstractions, for example, as equivalence classes of convergent series of nested extended bodies, or in many other ways, as we saw yesterday, filters, etc., etc., etc. Now, what are the motivations for this view? What are the motivations, to speak the language we spoke yesterday, for going boundary free or point free, for example, in doing geometry or topology and more generally theory of space? Well, there were several kinds of motivation. Perhaps the most common in the 20th century is a set of motivations that come from epistemology. So let me just mention Whitehead. In the Inquiry, 1919, he was very specific about this. He said, an investigation into the foundations of geometry has to show how the geometric relations between points issue from the ultimate relations between the ultimate things, which are the immediate objects of knowledge. Thus, the starting point of such an investigation is a discussion of the character of the immediate data of perception. It is not open to mathematicians to assume sub silentio that points are among these data. We just don't have any, they're not, among the data of perception. Now, a lot, of course, can be said about this motivation and about this approach. For a while, I was convinced that it was on the wrong track. Raphael convinced me that there is a big difference here between rejecting the idealized notion of a boundary in favor of an abstract notion. They're not really on a par. But let me remind you what Theodore de Laguna, in a paper that he published in 1922, and that has some impact, in fact, on Whitehead, published in the Journal of Philosophy, Point, Line, and Surface as Sets of Solids, wrote, commenting on Whitehead's approach. He said, instead of the point, which we do not perceive, we are given a class of solids such as we do perceive. But although we perceive solids, we perceive no abstractive sets of solids. And there is no indirect empirical assurance that such sets exist. In accepting the abstractive set, we are as veritably going beyond experience as in accepting the solid of zero length. You may like it, you may not like it. This, trade-off between the Whiteheadian intuition and the de Laguna's misgiving, in my opinion, defines the epistemological part of the story. There are other issues. I'm going to mention just one, various logical puzzles that arise in connection with the notion of a boundary and that have been driving the discussion to the point that some people have rejected boundaries as a result of these puzzles. So it really goes back again to Aristotle, who commented not so much on spatial but on temporal boundaries in a famous passage of the Physics, where he said, inasmuch as it is the same now that belongs to both past and future, and it is possible for a thing to be in motion throughout one time and to be at rest throughout the other, it will follow that the same thing can at the same time be both at rest and in motion, for both the times have the same extremity, the now. Both at rest and in motion. That sounds like a violation of the principle of non-contradiction. No wonder Graham Priest has started reading Aristotle. You know, to be and not to be, that's the answer. Many centuries later, Leonardo da Vinci has a nice passage in his notebooks, but instead of saying both and, says neither nor. Says, what is it that divides the atmosphere from the water? It is necessary that there should be a common boundary, which is neither air nor water, but it is without substance, because a body interposed between two bodies prevents their contact. Francisco Suarez, who actually can be classified as a follower of the classical view, even though he thought that boundaries can be separated from their bodies, at least by God. He also addressed the puzzle in a way that's very familiar to us today, even though, I guess, not directly through Suarez. Suppose that in the continuous surface of a wall, one half is maximally white and the other half is maximally black. From this, it further happens that in the same indivisible boundary of matter, there would be, at the same time, the specific substantial forms with respect to something that is indivisible in extension. You see the puzzle, how it's growing, and eventually, I guess the most common version of it, with an important moral, is the one that comes from Peirce in the Logic of Quantity, 1893. There is a line of demarcation between the black spot and the white paper. So he said, suppose some ink falls on a sheet of paper. So there is this line of demarcation. Now I ask about the points of this line. Are they black or white? Why one more than the other? Or are they A, both black and white, or B, neither black nor white? So that's A is Aristotle, B is Leonardo, right? Why A more than B? Why B more than A? Dot, dot, dot. The logical conclusion is that the points of the boundaries do not exist. That line of thinking has a very long story, but it eventually yields this sort of negative answer. And I know several people who actually sympathize with this way of thinking. Now, I should say I am not impressed by these arguments in favor of the negative answer. I appreciate the motivations, and I do think that there is a puzzle to be solved here, but I'm actually quite a friend of boundaries, and I'm worried about a second question rather than this very basic ontological one. So let's pretend that we agree that there are such things as boundaries. Perhaps it's fine, most of what I'm going to say will be fine even if you retrieve them as higher order entities. The question I'm interested in is this: are boundaries natural in some sense, or are they artificial? Now, the distinction I have in mind can be illustrated nicely with reference to geography. And in fact, here I would like to quote Lord Curzon of Kettlestone. He was the Viceroy of India. And he was not really a nice politician. He did awful things. But in 1907, he was invited to give the Romanes lecture, and he gave a lecture called Frontiers. And to my knowledge, during these lectures, based on his experience, he gave the best characterization of the distinction I have in mind insofar as it emerges in the domain of geography and geopolitics. He was distinguishing, he said he must distinguish between the category of natural frontiers and the category of artificial frontiers, a distinction, by the way, that today we all accept, and it's very familiar from the way atlases are done, etc., but which really comes from him. And the artificial frontiers are those boundary lines which, not being dependent upon natural features of the Earth's surface for their selection, have been artificially or arbitrarily created by man. So, which of these is artificial, which of these is natural.
Well, it's completely natural.
Now, some wars are fought precisely because people think that this boundary really must be there because it's natural. But anyway, there is some intuition here to the effect that there is a big difference between the two cases. This has not been drawn by us. This has been drawn by us. If you're not happy with Austria, I knew that someone in this room would have complained. Let me give you, actually I had another one first. Let me give you Colorado. That is definitely an artificial boundary. I thought I had Wyoming. That's also, it's very hard if you live in those places to feel a sense of belongingness and to fight a war to defend your boundaries. But anyway, those are clear cases of artificial boundaries. This is Thomas Jefferson's drawing for the creation of the states of the Northwest Ordinance, and although we still don't have Wyoming, etc., but you see how he did it, really, with a pencil and in a way a ruler. It's clear that those boundaries are artificial in the relevant sense. Barry Smith, whom most of you know, in a nice paper from 1995 called On Drawing Lines on a Map, put it this way: some of Jefferson's delineations correspond to what we might call bona fide boundaries, coastlines, river banks, and the like. So if you, for example, these, right? These are boundaries in the things themselves. They would exist and did already exist even in the absence of all delineating or conceptualizing activity on our or Jefferson's part. However, there are also delineations which correspond to no genuine heterogeneity on the side of the bounded entities themselves. Let us call boundaries of this created sort fiat boundaries, to draw attention to the sense in which they owe their existence to acts of human decision or to related human cognitive phenomena. So here's the distinction I'm interested in then. On the one hand, artificial boundaries. They're fiat entities. They're the result of complex decision-making processes, the product of collective intentionality that translates into social, political, and administrative agreements, whereby it is determined where a certain territory begins and where it ends. Okay? Sometimes it's just a matter of individual intentionality. So I guess here no collective intentionality generated that map. Such boundaries need not correspond to genuine physical or otherwise objective discontinuities or differentiations in the underlying territory. You just draw a line, literally, on the map. By contrast, natural boundaries are bona fide entities characterized precisely by their apparent independence from our organizing activities. It wasn't we who drew the boundaries of Australia, or who drew the boundaries of Sicily, for that matter, or who draw the boundaries of lakes and seas and rivers and so on. It's not the result of our activity. Okay? Now, artificial boundaries may be subject to controversy, and people may fight and sacrifice their lives before an agreement is reached. That's a fact. They can be ignored or deleted and thereby go out of existence. New ones can be drawn and thereby come into existence. Not so with natural boundaries. We are free to ignore them for political administrative purposes, but we cannot ask a cartographer to omit them from a map of the world. I mean, this idea of ignoring them for political administrative purposes actually is by itself very interesting, but I don't have time to elaborate on it. I hope the idea is clear. So, for example, here's a picture of Lake Maggiore. No, which lake is this? Yes, Lake Maggiore in Italy. You know, you can omit all the administrative stuff, but you still get the boundary of the lake. can't really get rid of that. That's the intuition. Now, geography is a metaphor, of course. I'm introducing it just to introduce this notion. We can generalize to the world of ordinary experience. Boundaries stand out in every map we draw of the world, in every representation of the world. So not only the world of geography, but the world of experience at large. And so does the relevant artificial natural distinction. We think of a boundary every time we think of an entity as of something separated from its surrounding. That's how the notion of a boundary becomes central in philosophy, and that's why topology, as a theory of boundaries, becomes a very important tool for philosophy. So, objects, that's how we sort of recognize them. I mean, early days in artificial intelligence were based on, vision algorithms which exploited so-called edge recognition. The idea being that it is the boundary that delivers the relevant objects. How do we draw a flower? We just draw the boundary of the flower, right? Again, this will be a long story. I'll just give you one more picture, which is this. Why do we tend to reify holes? Because they have nice boundaries. I mean, no one would tend to reify portions of reality like that. But, it's got a nice boundary. Boundaries are a sign of objecthood, etc., etc. Now, in cases such as these examples, it's natural to think of the boundaries as of bona fide demarcations. In other cases, the boundaries are of the fiat sort, as with the boundary, for example, separating my part of the desk from my colleagues, or my head from my neck. There is a separation. I mean, after all, there's one thing called the head and one thing called the neck, but there is no natural boundary there, or for that matter, the sirloin from the flank on a butcher's chart. Here's an example. Okay? Those boundaries are sort of artificial. And the fact that they're artificial is confirmed by the fact that depending on where you are, these maps are different. So this is from Great Britain. This is actually the German one. It's very different. And this is the USA. You can see that this is the USA because there is your Wyoming and Colorado. They don't have much patience. They just, no. Anyway, so these are clear examples of artificial boundaries. Not only objects. Damn, I missed something here. Well, but also actions and other events have boundaries, including temporal boundaries. Aristotle's example was in that spirit. So here are a few examples of putative fiat temporal boundaries. The end of the war, Bob's turning 18 years old, the boundary between the first half of the race and the second half, versus bona fide boundaries such as Bob's birth and death, the point in the cooling process when water begins to solidify, or the point in the splitting of an amoeba when one animal suddenly becomes two. Now, the question I'm interested in is whether this distinction is in fact well-grounded, whether it's a real distinction or an empty one. It's clearly a good and useful conceptual distinction, but and by itself it's, I think, perfectly intelligible, and it's got a lot of importance from a political point of view. It's one thing to take up arms for the crestline of the Pyrenees, for example, quite another to sacrifice your life for a Jeffersonian line. But does the distinction correspond to a real difference? Now, this question bites very deeply, I think. It bites deeply because once the distinction has been recognized, it can be drawn across the board, not merely in relation to boundaries, but also in relation to those entities that may be said to have boundaries. If an entity enjoys natural boundaries, boundaries in reality, boundaries de re, if you like, One may suppose that its identity and survival conditions do not depend on us. This is sort of a realist view, that there are entities like that. By contrast, if some of its boundaries are artificial, then the entity itself is to some degree a fiat entity, the product of our world making. And this is sort of an anti-realist or perhaps constructivist conception of things. Now, that's not to say that fiat entities of the second sort are not real entities. So the fact that they're somehow carved out in an artificial way doesn't mean that they're not real. In fact, here's a good quote from Frege, from the Grundlagen. The objectivity of the North Sea is not affected by the fact that it is a matter of our arbitrary choice which part of all the water on the Earth's surface we mark off and elect to call the North Sea. That part is there. It's just that its boundary is drawn artificially. This is why mereology is also extremely important when you do metaphysics, because the part-whole structure of reality perhaps is, even a radical anti-realist like myself is willing to say that the part-whole structure is objective. It's not up to us. What we do is select some as opposed to other parts as salient and important for us. So that doesn't mean that they're not real. It does, however, mean that such entities, the fiat entities, those that have fiat boundaries, would only enjoy their individuality as a result of our cognitive and perhaps or social practices like the cookies carved out of the dough. I mean, the classic metaphor here is, let me add, the objectivity, to insist on Frege's point, the objectivity is independent, but their individuality, their being what they are, including their having the identity and survival conditions they have, depends on the baker's action. So here it is. These parts are there. Their objectivity is not in question. But the fact that now this guy has been selected and elected, that's up to the baker. Now, are there then any natural boundaries? That's the question that I think is important. That's the question, I believe, of realism phrased in topological terms, or at least geographic / topological terms. Well, although I gave you a bunch of examples before, let me conclude now with, with some messages expressing misgivings about a positive answer to that question. What is exactly the boundary of an island, for example, of Australia? That sounds like it's a natural, non-artificial, objective boundary. Well, from the airplane, true, we have the impression of seeing a shoreline and that it's there, that's been drawn by nature and not by man, as Lord Curzon says. But it's also true that when you actually go there at ground level, things look very different. So here is a sequence of, zooming. You see that nice line turns into a bit of a mess. And the closer you go, and the less you see a clear line. You see? And this is a nice island. If you go to places that have been badly corrupted by cement and dead animals and so on, it's even worse. It's much more disappointing. So, perhaps we could locate the boundary of the island at the water-sand interface. Apart from the fact that that's already a stipulation, but we could do that. Still, that boundary is constantly in flux, and it is only by filtering it through our cognitive apparatus, it's only by interpolating objects and concepts, so to speak, that a clear-cut line will emerge. Cartographers know this well. One works with calipers, but their opening is not fixed by nature. And in fact, there was a famous paper, a classic in the literature on fractals by Mandelbrot called "What is the length of the coast of Britain?" And you keep zooming, and you keep getting a different length. which is to say that the boundary itself is not somehow here. And what goes for Ireland goes for all prima facie natural geographical entities, beginning with the much extolled Italian peninsula from which I'm from. It may well be that the Alps are the most sublime, undeniable boundary the Almighty could have given us, as Giuseppe Mazzini wrote in the golden days of the unification of Italy. Fact is that recently, in fact, you'll see the year in a second, Italy and Switzerland, where the boundary is supposed to be located, we're still working on an agreement to fix the exact location of the boundary, because yes, we have the Alps. We have the Alps, but you know, the glaciers tend to melt and things move, so they had to actually come to an agreement. This is the agreement 2008. So, and the same goes for object. What's the boundary of an onion, of a cow, of a flower, of a material object? Professor Peter Simons, in a nice paper from 1991, which he probably forgot. Oh, you haven't? Good. Has a nice way of putting it. He said, if a microscopic body is a complex system of positionally indeterminate hadrons and leptons, the idea of a boundary as a real unitary side of the body is hard to maintain. A connected boundary would need to bridge the gaps between the particles, and thus would be an imaginary rather than real entity. Like saying the fakir's bed of nails has a flat top. I love this image. The point is that on closer look, we all know that the boundary of material objects involves the same degree of arbitrariness as that of a mathematical graph, smoothed out of scattered and inexact data, the same degree of idealization of a drawing obtained by connecting the dots, the same degree of abstraction as the boundaries of things in an impressionist painting. We look at the painting, there are no boundaries there in the, I mean, that's how impressionism is supposed to work, right? You just sort of extract the boundaries. Maybe this is a better example of how that works. Well, the world is like that, actually. The world, at least if physics is close to the truth, the world is like that. And these are objects. You connect the dots. This is from a magazine where this is actually a game. I don't know if in your languages you have these things. Other examples of connecting the dots. Sometimes it's just perception, right? This is a beautiful storm of birds. Here's another one. I guess this is photoshopped. But still, you see a school of fish, you know, a swarm of bees, you know, it's connecting the dots. The same is true of events, by the way, and temporal boundaries. When exactly did Aristotle's ball begin to move or cease to be at rest? On closer look, we all know that the body's being at rest amounts to the fact that the vector sum of the motions of the trillions of restless atoms of which the body is composed, average over time, equals 0. That's what it is. Anthony Galton actually at some point argued nicely for this view. And just to conclude with a few more examples and then a moral, when exactly did my life begin? When did it end? I said birth and death are good examples of temporal bona fide boundaries. Well, the controversies on abortion and euthanasia show that even the boundaries of our lives may be less natural than we might initially think. On closer look, often it is a matter of deciding whether a person is still alive, just as we must decide whether a person's, say, clinic death coincides with the end of her existence, and the criteria that guide our decisions give expressions, of course, to our opinions, our beliefs, our theories. Nor is there a clear criterion by which we can identify the initial boundary of a person's life. Surely not the birth, which is, of course, a pretty massive moment. Of course, maybe an administrator may be happy with that kind of answer to the question, but that's clearly not. Yes. Isn't the answer a matter of stipulations, agreements, decisions? We can base our decisions on as many factors as we like, including, of course, up to the minute scientific findings, but a decision it is. And if it is a matter of our decision, then it's not a natural boundary, and even a person's life becomes, to some extent, a fiat process. So, you see where this is going. Plato, the Phaedrus, the goal of the method of division is to be able to cut up each kind according to its species along its natural joints. And not to try, and to try not to splinter any part as a bad butcher might do. Now this has been driving a lot of work in the sciences as well as in common sense. You know, carve the world at the natural boundaries, at the natural joints. If all boundaries were the product of some cognitive or social fiat, if the lines along which we splinter the world out there depended entirely on our cognitive makeup and on the categories that we employ in drawing up our maps of the world, then our knowledge of the world would amount to neither more nor less than knowledge of our own maps. The thesis according to which all boundaries, and therefore all entities, are of the fiat or artificial sort, would take us straight to an extreme form of hermeneutics, or hermeneuticism. There are no facts, just interpretations, is a version of this view. On the other hand, to posit the existence of genuine bona fide boundaries, to think that the world comes pre-organized into natural objects and properties, reflects a form of naive realism that just doesn't seem to stand close scrutiny. So, question mark. Now, this is where I'm going to skip a big thing and get to the conclusion. So, here, your favorite story. You have to decide which side you belong to. So, for example, yesterday, Peter Simons gave us, well, the light makes this fuzzy, but that's Peter, and he gave us a nice way of sort of resisting the idea that it's all a matter of drawing lines in the sand, as it were. You know, for example, based on important biological or physical or chemical or causal properties, etc., etc. I'm not going to tell you what my favorite story is. I'm just going to come to the conclusion, which is in two remarks. First of all, well, I do sympathize with the positive answer. It's just fiat boundaries, just to tell you. But still, if we just replaced Plato's natural joints with Jefferson pen strokes, then it would be a disaster, I agree. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened and continues to happen in many cases. To draw lines, you know, in a completely silly way. Classifying people on the basis of their skin color or their sexual preferences turned out to be a very bad idea, like the imperialist partitioning of Africa, which cut across peoples and villages. To claim that they are natural is one thing, but in fact, this is really like drawing lines a la Jefferson. Here's another bad example of how we can be insensitive in drawing our lines. Nonetheless, it's precisely here in their arbitrary character that lies all the potential of, say, conventional or artificial boundaries. Arbitrary doesn't mean that anything goes, although people tend to be afraid, right? Arbitrary, then anything goes. No, arbitrary means that it is up to us, in nostro arbitrio, to draw the line. It means that it is up to us to adopt the conventions that we think are best suited to our needs and to modify them if they don't work. Not because they go against nature, but because they fail to do justice to those very needs. Second, if we wish to insist on the natural, objective status of some boundaries, let us at least try not to cheat. There's no worse rhetoric than that which disguises the artificial as something natural. I know here I'm getting political, but I'm almost done. If a boundary is artificial, it may, in course of time, come to involve all sorts of substantive markers, barriers, walls, barbed wire fences, electronic devices, etc. Yet this is not a process of ontic transformation. Such markers can be very robust, but not so robust as to turn the artificial into the natural. The Chinese Great Wall, well, that has survived for centuries, but the Berlin Wall lasted a mere 50 years, and Israel's separation wall in the West Bank has not even been recognized, that's the word, by the International Court of Justice. It's an artificial, in spite of its being very material. On September 22nd, 2005, the US Secretary of Homeland Security used his power to waive in their entirety the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act to extend a fence along the US-Mexico border through the Tijuana River estuary. A few months later, the San Diegans were playing volleyball with the Tijuanians using the fence as a net. You can't make the artificial into a natural thing. I stop here. Thank you.